Good evening. Good evening. My name is John Barton. I'm the director of the Architectural Design Program here at Stanford. Welcome to the second lecture in our 2016 Architecture, Landscape Architecture Spring Lecture Series. Last year, the lecturers explored the theme of the moment in an attempt to answer the question, is there an architecture of the moment? This year's theme, Live, Work, Play, focuses on how design is responding to the melding of the way we work, recreate, and live today. I want to thank Dave Lennox, Sarah, Padma, and Zach from the University Architects Office for organizing this series. We are honored to have truly exceptional professionals with us this year. I would also like to thank the American Institute of Architects Santa Clara Valley chapter for their help in advertising this series and registering our program for continuing professional education credits. If you have not done so and you would like to, you can sign up for your continuing ed credits out in the lobby after the lecture. We are moving around to different venues this year. In case you hadn't noticed that, we're two different venues for two events. You can visit our website to find out where they are. The next one will be back here with Kevin Conger, and there will be a reception immediately afterwards, I suspect, outside these roll-up doors, which are behind the curtain here. So put that on your calendar as a reception that you are all welcome to attend. And then after that, we'll be back in where we were 2 weeks ago for the remainder of the lectures. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Jensen. As the founder of Jensen Architects, Mark Jensen cultivated his view of the art and science of architecture into an award-winning design practice that celebrates inquisitiveness, craftsmanship, and partnership. These values come naturally to Mark, who grew up among artisans and designers and deepened through his academic and early experience in the United States and Italy. After earning a Bachelor of Architecture degree at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, a program recognizes for its emphasis on building science, he worked with renowned architects Super Studio, Jim Jennings, and Mark Mack, as well as noted fashion designer Enrico Coveri. An active member of the San Francisco Bay Area arts and design community, Mark is a former chair of the California College of the Arts CCA Interior Architecture Department and the Headland Center for the Arts Board of Trustees. Mark's work is noted for bridging culture and construction. His recent notable projects include SF's Mona Sculpture Garden, which I think is one of the finest urban environments in San Francisco, offices for Goodby Silverstein and Partners and IDEO, graduate studios for CCA, and the Shed Store and Cafe in Healdsburg. Please give a warm Stanford welcome to Mark Jensen.
Thank you. So first question, is this working? You can hear? Excellent. Thanks for the invitation. Happy to be down here. It's always interesting to give a lecture. I'm going to show some work, talk about our work, but I try to be responsive to the theme, and the live, work, play idea embedded in the description that I read in the lecture series is how this has increasingly challenged our collective work-life balance. This is old news for architects, so we live this. But I'm going to try to address that in maybe two ways. One, to talk about how the spaces that we work on do or don't respond to these different project types. But maybe speak more specifically about what I think really challenges our live-work balance, which is technology. Just had a interesting chat with some students about this and all the devices that we carry around with us and our ability to be connected anytime, any place. It's self-evident by now that changes how we live our day-to-day lives, but the question that I was asking the students is how does that change the production or construction or consumption of architecture and buildings? So maybe speculate on that a little bit tonight, in addition to showing some of our projects. So I've divided my slides into 4 parts: photography, radical visions, which gets in a little bit of my background. Arts ecosystems, we do a lot of projects in the arts and cultural, and then maybe address the live, work, play typology last. So photography. Some of you may have seen this article recently in the New Yorker. but it struck me as being, well, true. We've probably all been places where this is pretty much all you see, people not really engaging directly with the environment that they're in, but capturing the moment on their phones. So in the future, we will photograph everything and look at nothing. This article had a couple great quotes that I wanted to start with. This one is not new. Some of you may have heard Susan Sontag say, "Today everything exists to end in a photograph." She was probably ahead of her time because this was 1977, but today it seems self-evident that we all walk around the world capturing the moment, and our purpose seems to be to have every moment end in a photograph. It's another quote in this article that intrigued me even more. I'll read a part of this. Photography has seen the value shift from the standalone individual aesthetic of the artist to the collaborative social aesthetic of services like Facebook and Instagram. So now when we think about photography, we don't think about the photographer who has a specific individual vision. We think about this fabric, this mosaic of photographs that exists on social media. As someone who is personally very interested in photography, I always have been, and I've embarrassed to admit that I used to have quite a little nice Nikon setup, lots of lenses, little parallax correction for taking pictures of buildings. I downgraded to a little compact camera, then I got my first digital camera, then I got my phone, and then I just committed the ultimate sin. I set my camera on square mode so I can Instagram. So I'm guilty of this too. But this idea that photography of architecture wouldn't be any more about hiring the specialist architectural photographer who has their own aesthetic and vision, or is directed by the architect, deciding how we want our buildings to be seen. It is instead this mosaic of lots of people taking pictures. So I was just telling students that we just met with that we have so much work in our office these days that I'm not able to go to every job site meeting during construction, which is a shame because after all the hard work, construction is the funnest part, one of the funnest parts about what we do. But I've noticed that since some of the younger kids in my office made me get on Instagram, that a lot of our clients are posting pictures of their projects under construction. So I found that I've been able to keep track of jobs through my Instagram feed, which is very strange. I'd show up for Monday morning staff meetings and say, "Hey, how come that beam wasn't aligned with that column?" They said, "When did you go to the job site?" It's like, "No, it just showed up." But maybe more interestingly, even after a project is done, we get this documentation of our work that never existed before, that's telling perhaps a richer story than the one point of view of the professional architecture photographer. It's telling a story that is different times, different uses, and different people, different occasions, and something that you could never capture with one photo shoot. So that was the project in Shed. I'll show you more pictures of later. This is a project we've just finished for 500 Cap Street, David Ireland's house and studio, and some work of the Minnesota Street project, a new arts venue that I'll also talk a little bit about later. So I'm intrigued by this compared to this. So this is my website, and this is a professional photograph of a building. So in defense of the photographer, the building wasn't done, so there's no people here. Normally we would like to photograph our buildings with people. But as technically good as this photograph is, it's obviously much less seductive than this mosaic, this fabric of images. So just speculating now on how architecture gets consumed and whether this might start to change how architects think about the work that they do. So, well, of course, we don't really rely on just a single a single image. We have project pages that have multiple images, but still these are all of one hand. And you would just never get an image like this. So this is opening night. There was 6,000 people showed up, much to the surprise of my clients. This is a neighbor across the street who had nothing to do with the project, just looking out on their balcony, wondering what's going on, taking this picture, doing the little tilt shift filter, and I even like the caption, "My street is popping off skis." So even if I wanted to, I could have never got this vantage point of this moment. So this made me think more about photography's relationship to architecture, or maybe media more broadly relationship to what we do. And I've always been a fan of what Adolf Loos said about his own buildings, which is a true building makes no impression as a picture reduced to 2 dimensions. So what we do is 3-dimensional, and it evolves over time, unfolds over time. It is my greatest pride that the interiors I have created are completely lacking in effect when photographed. So, just being polemical here, it's not entirely true. I think this is one of his interiors, Villa Mueller. I think this photograph has a certain effect. But what this doesn't capture is the spatial complexity of this project. So, I know we probably have a diverse group in the audience, but those of you who are architects or studying architecture probably know this building, and you know that it is spatially impossible to capture in photographs, and even in plans, it's challenged to understand how it works. It did make me wonder if Adolf Loos would rethink his quote in the age of Instagram, because with now this mosaic or fabric of photographs, already you're learning a lot more than the single still image. For example, I didn't know that there was a outdoor shower on the roof until I saw this. I didn't know that there seems to be this sort of repeating green theme running through lots of the materials. I didn't know how different this building looked in the winter versus the summer with deciduous vines. So already this kind of crowdsourcing of imagery tells more of a story, but I would argue still doesn't capture the spatial quality. So this is a section, I think when this building was built, I read that it's a story taller than it was allowed to be. I think it's technically 5 and you're allowed to have 4. But because of the complicated step sections, depending on where you cut the plan, it looks like a 3-story house. So they were able to get this through the building department and technically exceed the number of stories. But you start to see some of the sectional things happening here. But even this doesn't tell the story. So if you Google this house, what you'll find is probably thousands of architecture students in various studios have tried to document this house in 3 dimensions. And now we start to get a little sense of the complicated step sections in the volumes, telling more of the story. But then I think you, at some point, need to rely on some inspiration from artists to understand space. This is Rachel Whiteread's work. She did a casting. If you don't know this project, it's a casting of a house in the UK that was then demolished, leaving the casting of the interior volume. And I was struck by how much that looks like this representation of the Loos house, where you're seeing, if you look in the lower right, you're seeing the negative space of the fireplaces of the house. In fact, you can even see the soot from the fires left in the casting of the concrete. So I, when I was teaching years ago, I actually did an exercise where I had my students do 3D CAD models of the inside of their projects as if they were solids. And some of the shapes that you get were actually kind of amazing. It's the front of the house. But digging further into maybe what artists have to teach us about representation or photography and architecture, this is now Gordon Matta Clark, his project called Splitting, where he's taken a house, cut it in half, pried it open, and you get this incredible slot of light through the middle of the house. That's him on the right intervening. So there's a whole bunch of things that are super amazing about his work or this project specifically, but for purposes of my chat tonight, I'm interested in his photo documentation of his projects. So because he cut the house in half, he was able to stand in each room, take a photograph in each room, and then collage them back together as if you now have almost an X-ray vision of the house. So something that we can't normally do. We don't cut our buildings apart, but this gets back closer to what sections do in architectural drawing. So maybe to conclude this little section, we try to do an exercise in my office from time to time where we get together as a group and we just talk about or jot down thoughts about what we think defines our work or what we're interested in investigating in our work. Maybe before you get to firm descriptions and project descriptions, but just what are some of the themes we're interested in investigating. So this is, when we did this exercise last, this is something I wrote down, that one should think about ideas before space, you should think about space before materials, and you should think about materials before image. So I'm suggesting that the directionality, if there is a direction to this process, should be sort of top-down. And it's my impression that perhaps in the age of Instagram, that we are starting to think more the reverse, that we think about image first, and then maybe later how to materialize it, and think about that as space, and you might kind of run out of steam before you get to ideas. So that might sound slightly critical. It's maybe there's a little bit of criticism embedded in that, but it's just the way we live, this is the way we interact with our built environment. And I'm finding that now when I have a new client, 9 times out of 10, their first thing they do is send me their Pinterest board of all the cool things that they've seen and liked. So on one hand, this is amazing tool because picture is worth 1,000 words. You get a little sense of what they're interested in, but it's kind of radically superficial because you're seeing images, you're seeing colors, maybe materials, but you're not really understanding space or maybe some more abstract concepts behind that. So for me, this discussion or this relationship with social media or smartphones or technology, it's something that we can't deny. It's the world we live in, but maybe it's worth having a slightly critical posture, distance, to think about its effect on what we do. So next part, radical visions. This is getting a little bit into my background, which is alluded to in the introduction. This is where I went to school, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Beautiful place. When I was there, it was really a sleepy little town. There was no Starbucks or Gaps yet, and a really kind of marvelous landscape. But one of the best things about, I had great education and just a great group of students. The best part of it, though, was I got to do my last year here. Cal State has a study abroad program, and I could now go on a digression about Brunelleschi and Michelangelo and Giotto and Piero della Francesca, but instead I want to talk about these guys. This is Super Studio, and the guy in the lower left is Cristiano Toraldo di Francia. And I used to have to talk about Super Studio's work and give a whole bunch of backstory because nobody knew who they were. But they're having a bit of a moment right now. Tonight in Rome is the opening of probably the largest retrospective of their work ever. And on the occasion of that, there was an article in the Times last weekend talking about them. So it's fantastic that they're maybe having a rediscovery of what they're interested in. I think their work has been immensely influential to contemporary architects, but maybe for different reasons. So it's important to understand that this is a project, a series of drawings called the Continuous Monument Just imagine the world sort of engulfed by this grid that took over cities and landscapes. It's important to understand that these were intended as critiques, not as proposals. So they were operating in the, say, 70s. This is probably mid-70s. And they were witnessing what they would say is the materialism of late modernism maybe starting to serve corporate interest and losing some of its original utopian thrust. So they started doing these renderings which were showing the modernist project to its logical extreme. So pure abstraction taking over landscapes. And you can look at this and start to imagine this as built form. In fact, if you Google them, you'll just see those crazy commentary like, how could they do that to the coastline? That's so horrible. It's like, well, that's their point. They weren't proposing this. It was intended as critique. But what's interesting about their work is there is a very specific vocabulary which they did eventually put into some real projects. This rendering, it's called supersurface. So it might at first glance look very much like the other collages that I just showed, but the message is 100% the reverse. This is now proposing a kind of utopia where it's this surface that connects everyone on the planet, and we no longer need objects. So if you read the text around this project, you could argue that they have predicted the internet. They're talking about instant communication between all people across the globe without any physical objects, and everybody's in complete direct communication with each other. So this, although the rendering style is the same and you see the repeating grid, this was intended as a kind of utopian statement, not a dystopian statement like the earlier ones. I had two professors there. The second one is this fellow, Johnny Petina. So he operated more as, let me just back up and say a couple things about Superstudio. By the time I had arrived in Florence, they were all still working in the same building, but no longer as Superstudio. So the band had broken up, but they were still cohabitating. And they had started to build, and it's very interesting to look at what they built after this kind of radical polemics. When they started to build, they had to react to the reality of Italy, and their work became almost as obsessive in reverse, and just this crazy intense detail and craftsmanship on tiny, tiny little projects, which is around the time that I eventually worked in their office. So what I learned from them was both the sort of conceptual ideas, but also the crazy attention to detail and craftsmanship that you can get in Italy. So Johnny's work was much more conceptual. This project is called Tumbleweed Capture. He came to America and toured around for sites to intervene and built this structure. The idea was that tumbleweeds would blow across the plains and get caught by this thing, and then it would form its own enclosure over time. I think in reality he placed all these tumbleweeds, but you get the idea of this kind of naturally occurring architecture. Or this project called Vestirsi di sedie. So the English translation is wearable chairs, but that's actually wrong because that's all about the chair. The more direct translation is wearing chairs or put on a chair, meaning like dress yourself with a chair, which is more about the act of doing this and moving through the city, not about the chair itself. Although the chair itself is also a beautiful object. Okay, so that's a little background. We've had the fortune to work on quite a few arts and cultural projects in the office. And I'm going to take you through some of these. The reason I've chosen the word ecosystem is what I've discovered, what I've learned working with these organizations is that we live in a very expensive place. It's kind of old news that artists can't afford to live in San Francisco or the Bay Area anymore, but increasingly arts organizations and galleries are also being priced out. So we've been doing a lot of pro bono work for smaller arts organizations to help them find permanent homes in the city. So it's great that SF MoMA will be opening again in a month. That's fantastic news for the Bay Area. But we also need to be nurturing the residency programs, the arts colleges, the artist studio space if we want to have a real functioning ecosystem. So speaking of SF MoMA, this is our rooftop garden project. What I'll emphasize maybe with a bunch of the work that we show is a couple core ideas. One is the sort of transformability of space beyond just the California indoor-outdoor thing. I mean, spaces that literally become outdoors. So this is the main pavilion, but when the doors open up, the gallery becomes an exterior space, or the garden runs right through it. We made this space first and foremost for art, so it was meant to accommodate sculpture. The architecture wouldn't compete with the artwork, but it's also a space for dining and relaxing, and a cafe, and I think the food program is going to be increased when it reopens. And it's meant to work during the day, during the night. There's a completely luminous ceiling that is supposed to extend the sky. So we call this a gallery without a ceiling. Every time I talk, we have to just pick some topics to focus on at the expense of others. I won't talk about detailing and material and structure as much tonight. But this is the lava of the project, and the wood and the carefully detailed joint between the two. But the main thing I'd emphasize is that with the space, we wanted to not preclude future unimagined uses of the space. So whether it's showing a single sculpture or whether it's a party like this, it's meant to accommodate all of the above. At the other end of the budget spectrum, Oakland Museum asked us to help them with to activate the entry courtyard, which was people would just pass through and not use. So we came up with this idea of a kit of parts. It's a blackboard with tables and chairs hung on the wall as you'd find them in a shaker house, so that when it's all up on the wall, it looks almost like a painting or a three-dimensional static work of art. But people could interact with it, take chairs down, and then they would have workshops here and programming. This is meant to be a temporary installation of a couple months, and it ended up being there for a couple years. It was so successful. Another small project with chairs. This is in the Presidio. We were invited to participate in very interesting challenge. They had architects, landscape architects, and each participant had a client, and a client was an animal that lived in the Presidio. So our client was the great blue heron, which you can see if you look carefully right there. So we did some research on great blue heron and discovered that they are called still hunters. They are very, very quiet and still until they see their prey, and then they act. So thought we're going to take some cues for that. We're not actually going to design habitat for the great blue heron, but we're going to mimic their behavior. And we set up these chairs strategically placed with the idea that people moving through this beautiful collection of old buildings would get very specific vantage points and might slow down and pause to look at the buildings or the wildlife or the views. Another arts-related project. This is a collaboration we got to do with artist Ann Hamilton. It is a 6-story concrete tower up in Sonoma County. These are 28-inch thick concrete walls with massive foundation. I remember 30 some odd piers that go down probably as deep as this is tall. And inside is a double helix spiral staircase where this is first and foremost a sculpture. It's open to the sky. You can look at it as just an object. But it's also a performance space. And what's amazing about witnessing a performance here is that usually the performers are on one stair, the audience is on another, so they're wrapped around each other, completely unlike the usual sort of proscenium separation between audience and performer. And the acoustics are incredible. But again, this idea of just sort of creative occupancy and using things for other than their intended purposes if you design them to encourage that. So this is another one of the performances that use the exterior of the tower. Another arts-related project that we have just finished, I'm speaking with the assumption that maybe not everyone know who these artists are. If you do, bear with me. If you don't, look them up. David Ireland, super important conceptual artist in the Bay Area. His house became his home, his studio, and ultimately his most important work of art. So he worked in this building, he intervened in this building, he excavated in this building, he stripped back the layers of finishes to expose the original plaster and then sealed it to give it this almost luminous quality. And then he used objects found in the house from the previous owner to make works of art. So this collection of old brooms he found from the previous owner, stitched them together. This is now in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. So David had passed right when we started this project, and the house was going on the open market. And this was terrifying to the arts community because there's a whole bunch of history here, and it probably would have been sold and lost forever. So our client purchased this, has turned it into a foundation. You can now visit the house, limited hours. This is his dining room where almost everyone in the arts community of San Francisco has a story about a dinner party here. So our challenge was how to preserve this house, which was in actually sketchy shape. I'm going to jump to the end. The house was on a brick foundation, and then David had excavated underneath that to make some space for himself, and he was using the dirt as a material for his art. So you're already starting with a brick foundation, then you take away most of the dirt underneath that. Every engineer and contractor that walked through here went running for the front door. So our challenge was first and foremost to stabilize the house. Then we had to preserve the house and really respect his work inside the house. But our client also wanted to add some program. So as long as we had to put in a new foundation anyways, we dug a little deeper, got space for an archive and study center. The yellow is the original house, and then there's a flex space, which for the planning department we call the garage. And it's really used as a gallery, a reception space. This is a door for the public to enter, and then they get essentially a backyard on top of this building that they never had before for outdoor events. So this is the gallery set up with some of David's drawings. And then some photos of the relationship between the new and the old. So painstaking project. They couldn't jack up the house because that plaster was so sensitive, so they're working mostly without power tools. Sonoma County Museum, this is a very simple project. The museum is mostly a history museum, but they expanded into the space next door, and we gave them, we opened up the space and gave them these new light monitors that are skylights, but they have scrim underneath them that are backlit, so by day or by night you get these light monitors. Been doing some work with Fort Mason Center. We were fortunate enough to win a competition together with West 8 for a long-range campus master plan that imagined a whole bunch of things. They're sort of changing some of their tenants, trying to make themselves financially sustainable, trying to figure out how to pay for very expensive repairs of not just renovated building, but renovating the substructure over the water. So one of our proposals was to take this abandoned Pier 1 and turn it into a kind of art hotel where it would bring in revenue for the center, but also have publicly accessible art galleries so the public still had access to it. And this is, you can imagine the views from this when this eventually happens. In the meantime, we've been working on initial steps with the master plan. Our first project was to take the old machine shop, which had been filled with carpet and partitions, and basically you couldn't see the historic structure. So we brought it back to its original bones. This is the first exhibition. It's the artist Janet Cardiff. It's called 40-Part Motet. It's a recording of 4 different voices. Each speaker is a single voice. So you can walk around and stand almost like next to a person. So instead of all the sound coming from one place or from 2 channels, you get each voice pulled apart separately. been doing many projects with the California College of the Arts. This is their graduate center. College is in part of town that can be a little sketchy. The college wanted a security fence. We said, okay, if you're going to have a fence, we'll make it the whole facade. So we wrapped the front of it with this metal mesh, which is sort of reflected by day but lets the light of the building come out at night. Studios inside. And then more recently, this was converted to upper division design studios, so it's much more open plan now. And this would reinforce a point that something we aspire to, which is to make buildings that aren't designed for a specific single purpose, but can have life for many different uses over time. So this idea of flexibility is key for us. I think in my earlier days of my practice, flexibility meant having fun with moving parts. So this is a big wall at CCA that, if you notice, there's a little tiny caster there, and the whole wall is hinged so that studios can open up onto the central space during critiques, almost like storefronts on a street. But I think maybe beyond moving parts, another aspect of flexibility that we try to do with offices a lot is just diversity of space types, so you have lots of different choices about where to go. And then maybe ultimately the central space at CCA is the best example of this, is this long-term flexibility for creative occupancy. So this used to be a Greyhound repair facility. It's now become an art college. They're continuing to build and change things inside. And the space is so powerful in its spatial character and the quality of light and the volume that it can be many different things. So last arts project I'm going to show you is there is a newly named district in San Francisco called Do-Re-Mi. This is a bit of a stretch, but it's Dogpatch, Potrero Hill, and Mission District. And there is increasingly a kind of exodus from downtown of art galleries who can't afford the real estate anymore. And they all tend to be finding themselves in this neighborhood, this newly named neighborhood. But it didn't really yet have a sense of place, and I think our clients for this project came along, and their goal is to, I say single-handedly, they say it's in cooperation with many other people, but they're trying to save the gallery scene in San Francisco. They said they don't want to live in a city where they can't have art galleries to go to. So with this project, they're providing below market rate space for galleries. They're not a nonprofit, but they will probably lose money. Their spaces are less expensive per square foot, but they're also cheaper because they provided a bunch of shared facilities. So it's almost like co-housing for galleries, where they can share conference rooms, they can share packing facilities, and they can rent square feet. So it's a double way of saving money. So these are construction photos. It just opened recently. So this is building number 1 of 3. This one is galleries. There's artist studio building across the street we're working on, and then a third facility for art storage. This is what we found when we got there. I think with a lot of our projects, our first rule would be do no harm. This building was amazing. It's like these beautiful, super thin tensile trusses, this old weathered plank ceiling. So we tried to preserve that while putting in almost doubling the square feet of the building. So laid out the galleries around the perimeter. This may be more interesting in section. It has these double roofs where we kept the central space intentionally open as an atrium, as a volume. And I think it was always the intention from the beginning that galleries could use this common central space, again, to put up a larger show or to have special events. But I think we had no idea of how successful this would become. I think they have a backlog already of organizations wanting to rent this shared central space. So these are some of the original renders. So we put in the entire second floor. So what happens is the ground floor galleries get this relatively generous ceiling height underneath a new structure, and then the galleries at the top floor get to be right underneath and closer to these original trusses. So, again, back to my original discussion of how these projects get consumed is not the right word, documented. exhibited after the fact. This is a professional architectural photographer's photo. It's very beautiful. All the verticals are parallel, and they have a nice eye. They've got like these lines like lined up perfectly here. So I love this photograph, but in the spirit of social media, these are just some other shots that I randomly grabbed. Some of them are quite beautiful compositionally. This is looking from the bridge over the main space into one of the galleries. This one I thought is quite stunning. I mean, I think the thing about social media is not just that it is a way to experience work through lots of different eyes, which sounds like diversity of vantage points, but also the opposite is true. So back to that original quote, there becomes this kind of not single person's aesthetic, but this broader social aesthetic. And you see, if you start looking at Instagram photos, that there's this language, shared language, where, for example, overly saturated photographs are just all in right now. Like, you used to say, God, that's overexposed. Well, now it's like, gotta have it. This is what everyone, even professional photographers are starting to do. But maybe back to more important things, being able to capture a space in use that you wouldn't be able to do. So they're using this stadium stair at the end of the atrium for special events, and I couldn't resist this one. So last part, we're going to talk about some projects within the specific areas of the title of the series here. Live, work, play. So this means mostly live would be houses, work would be office or workplace, and play, we might say, is the third place, the cafes and restaurants and shops. So I think by way of introduction back to my office group exercise of thinking about what we do, a woman in my office wrote this on her card. We make offices that could be houses, cafes that could be museums, and schools that could be churches. So this isn't made up. We actually have done all these things. And I think this is super interesting. I'm not interested in form follows function as a rule. I'm more interested in form that doesn't preclude function or get in the way of unimagined functions. So the fact that we can have spaces that aren't really designed to look specifically like a building type or a use type, I think is super interesting. And in terms of this work-life balance, you definitely see examples of maybe people using their houses as home offices or offices that look more like residences. So this blurring of types for me would be a positive. So some workplace stuff. This is IDEO's offices on a pier in San Francisco. So most of you probably know David Kelly, founder of this company, and the D School, and all sorts of great stuff. So big, beautiful open space. Again, first rule, do no harm. Well, actually, uncover previous harm. So this floor had been completely covered in asphalt because it was shipping and receiving. It was unloading of boats. So it was about 3 inches thick of asphalt that we took up and found these beautiful old planks underneath. And then they're primarily open office, collaborative office environment, like most of our clients these days. But when you do that, you really have to provide an abundance of other types of spaces to retreat. So their project spaces are intentionally only 3-sided. They, as we've been working with them over the years, the fourth side has disintegrated from being a wall with a door to being a sliding glass door to being nothing. And the idea is that everybody in the office sees what's happening in the project, so there's this communication and sharing of ideas. But when you do that, you do need to give people places to go away, so we've got a little phone booth immediately adjacent to that. Big, common, open communal kitchen, which is directly linked to their primary conference room. So they're constantly doing events where they're using the kitchen or the reception space as part of their sort of presentation and interaction. And then coming back to technology, this is well, it's a video conferencing center, but it's not in a separate room, it's just furniture. So increasingly we'll find technology not relegated to a specialist room, but really distributed more evenly through the workplace. Goodby Silverstein and Partners, project we did for them in a skyscraper in San Francisco. And what was one of the things interesting about this project is everybody, not just creative office, creative agencies, creative businesses, everybody wants sort of funky south of market-like space. But there's not enough of it to go around. So increasingly what we're finding is, or having the opportunity to do, is take Class A space and make it look more like Class C space. So to rough it up. So we're, this is original photography and architectural record in the upper left. So these spaces would always have carpet or maybe linoleum, dropped ceiling, grid of fluorescent lights. But usually when you take these things up, you find some interesting things, you know, beautiful concrete slabs underneath it, and generally much higher volumes above the drop ceiling. Now there's some things you got to do when you do this, like deal with acoustics and mechanical systems, and it's not as simple as it sounds. But we're able to take this previously sort of high-rise office and make it a much more open environment, including, again, this idea of walls that disappear. And then when you do that, what you really start to notice is this kind of amazing precast concrete skin that this building had, these beautiful framed windows. So we try to organize the office around really 360-degree views, in this case out to the Golden Gate Bridge, or in some smaller rooms where it's almost like a framed photograph on the wall. This is a little lounge retreat collaboration space. There used to be a lot of examples of precast concrete facades on skyscrapers in San Francisco, which have been disappearing for maybe two reasons. One is maybe they're just out of fashion, compared to glass skin buildings. But a more practical reason is they're heavy, so a lot of times you'll see these buildings getting refurbished where they take off the heavy skin and put on a light glass skin just for seismic reasons. So some other moments in the office. So we had distributed in this very open plan a series of unique little almost creature-like rooms. This one is like a little mini theater with a little cantilevered end that when you're inside you get this kind of vertiginous view down 20 stories to the street. This might look like a setup, but these people are really doing this. It's not an Apple ad. Using circulation for as a collaborative place to work. But this isn't only creative agencies, even this is a financial services company. And they had a very traditional program, which is they want private offices for all their executives, period. So none of this open office stuff for them. But they were interested in collaboration in this space being full of light. So we gave them private offices around the perimeter, but they're all walled in glass. This is the space at night. And over each office, there's a little skylight that opens up to the skylight above. So these rooms feel very connected to the common space. And then you go upstairs and get this nice frame view of the Transamerica building. So it's that last office project I'll show. We like doing workplace design, particularly when our clients are interesting creative partners. But I have witnessed that office design has started to become a little bit like stage set design, where it's all about these tropes of fun. Everybody's competing for the same talent. You got to make your office look like a fun place to work. So it's foosball tables and free food, and you guys know the drill. So it's occurred to me that this has become a little bit less interesting as an architectural approach, because it really is more about these signifiers of things or stage set design. But what I really like about this project is these clients, I think, took this to the natural extreme, that weren't just sort of props from home or props of game tables. But we gave them this little armature where expose the original building back to its structure. And then in each structural bay, we did this nicely detailed little wood storefront. And then in each room, they really moved in as if it was their house. So, you know, you've got the living room, you've got, maybe this is a family room, you've got the game room, and you've got the kitchen. And so this sort of went to, it's like, this is just, you're working in your house. Okay, the play part, some retail and restaurant stuff. If it's not already apparent, what I think is unique about my office is we do not specialize in any one project type. Ridiculous diversity of project sizes and types, and some projects that really can't even be put into one category. So this is the shed. Downstairs it is a cafe, wine bar, fresh produce, homeware, farm supply. There's a mill, they're milling flour. All that's downstairs, and then upstairs is a big event space for community events, lectures, films, meetings. So this is in Healdsburg. It's really intended to be connected to the local food economy, so farmers, restaurants, food. So this is a ground-up building. We used pre-engineered metal building, sort of agricultural typology. We thought we were being site-sensitive. The planning department didn't think so. It baffled me that they thought using an agricultural building in an agricultural area was just weird, but they had no problem with the French chateau that was built next door. Anyways, so upstairs, this is the event space, and the idea was to make this as connected to the landscape and the outdoor as possible. So again, this is a Californian idea. I think we all architects, all people want to be connected to the landscape. But we try to take this maybe to more of an extreme or more radically open to the outside. So I think there's 11 garage doors in this project where you can completely open the building up to the outside. So this is the deck at the upper level. I mean, on the topic of sort of mixing work-life balance or mixing project types, the number of people that have told me or told the owners that they want to move into this space, they want to turn this into a house. Like, it could be a house. So upstairs there's a big commercial kitchen that services the whole building, but we have this big sliding wall that can close that off in the case of special events, so the flooring just wraps up the walls. And then downstairs you see the exposed structure, but it's really furnished with almost domestic type furnishings of tables, and this is the larder. And then the building at night. All right, here was another challenge we had with the planning department. This technically exceeds the maximum dimensions of a sign. So we argued that, hey, it's perforated, so if you don't count the holes, it's actually smaller. They didn't exactly buy that, but eventually they let us do it, and everybody's happy. So I said I can't talk about all aspects of the work tonight. There would be discussions about sustainability with this project or about the structural system we used. Pre-engineered metal buildings, like cheapest, fastest way to enclosed volume. A little bit harder when you put a second floor. But we're interested in this idea of sensible and thoughtful ways of building, and not just building like we've been building for 2,000 years or more. This is a collaboration with Project Frog. It's a pavilion and gift shop built on the anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge, and work with Project Frog to develop this kit of parts that is it is prefab in the sense that all the parts are made off-site, but it's assembled on-site. So lots of experiments these days around prefab. Most of them, I think, really misinformed. They're trying to build buildings and ship them down the road. Like, it doesn't make any sense to ship volume or air. You really want to think about shipping parts, flats, components. But when you start thinking about building this way, it's a challenge. There's things that we could do in our sleep that we propose, and they say, no, can't do that. Like a butt-jointed glass corner where there's no mullion. it's easy to do that. Well, there's some challenges, but we can do that. You can't do that here because you can't have a big corner piece that you can imagine putting that on a truck. It's a problem. So we solved it by having a much smaller butt-jointed corner and then meets a pre-glazed panel. So it does create some interesting challenges. This is the site in the interior. I think I heard from some Park Service official they're making more dollars per square foot on this retail space than any of their facilities. Cafe, we've done a couple locations for Blue Bottle Coffee. The main idea that we talked about with them was an idea that I think runs sort of through a lot of culture these days, which is about not separating front of house and back of house, making people feel like they're really participating in the process, where the staff and customer interaction is much more fluid. So the thought here was with the coffee bar, instead of a big counter like a wall between you and the barista, it's just a big table that you're all working around. So the barista is obviously on the back, customer on the front, but it floats off the ground, creates some plumbing and drain problems, challenges, but it really functioned really with the rest of the space about a collection of furnitures rather than just built-in architecture. And then another location for them in Venice, California, tiny, tiny little space. Some of the similar ideas about a very open floating bar, so there's less separation. But the main element here is, don't necessarily even notice it at first, but that blue panel in the background here is actually an incredibly complicated backlit LED light fixture, which is tuned to kind of have a relationship, not mimic exactly, but have a relationship with the Southern California sky and light outside. So it does change subtly over time, but intentionally slowly, so you don't really notice that it's changing color. So I think I'm going to end with the live part of the equation, some houses. This is a project up in Twin Peaks area of San Francisco. We were having a chat with some students before, and we're asking, well, how do you start a project with a client? And do you just listen to their brief and then give them the list of rooms or parts that they want? Yeah, you do that, but I would always try to uncover something in their brief that could be amplified to become a more important idea that seems specific to the site or the place of the client. So in this case, the client really, really, really wanted to have some, I think his words were, wow factor on the front of the building. So we made a really big deal about entering this house. You have this greenery embedded in the sidewalk. You step over, there's a waterfall that runs down the side here into a little trough, turns the corner and heads out towards the bay. So you have to step on a bridge or these steps over the water to get to the front door. Once you get to the front door, you're counterintuitively stepping into a vitrine where you're now on display back out to the public. So trying to intentionally do this slightly subversive move of playing with assumptions about privacy in a house. Now once you're in that space, you can go through a second door that you can securely close behind you. But when that's open, you see all the way through the house, all the way out to the bay beyond. So it's almost a see-through house. So our original clients sold this project, and then the new owners called us and asked us to work on the back of the building. And they also seemed interested in just developing a narrative or a story that was specific to them. And the view from up here is phenomenal. So we started discussion about just maximizing the glass and doing these, mullionless windows. But we wanted to take this one step farther. So this is I think it's 12-foot cantilevered glass balcony that you not only see the view, you are put out in the view. So you're really hovering over the city. So this was quite a structural challenge because there can't be too much flex on the structure with the glass floor. I think the glass was about 1.1/8 or 1.25 thick. These steel beams run all the way back into the house. This is the bedroom level below, but then at nighttime it's a pretty spectacular place to be. This is a mixed-use building. It's an office and a gallery and 3 residential units all combined into a hybrid building. Our client had purchased this old barn. It's completely, the roof was about to collapse, so we took the roof out, kept the original shell, and then put a new sort of glass building inside the old concrete building, and then played with the spaces between these two to become outdoor terraces. So this is the original, is a prune processing facility. So tried to keep the kind of massiveness of the original building, but we're cutting into it in new ways, not just cutting windows, but sort of like these apertures where you could keep the solidity but still see through the building to the landscape. And then upstairs, you get this view out to the vineyards and the hills beyond. I said I wasn't going to talk about structure, but there's an interesting structural thing here. This is, you notice there's no lateral system here at all on the front or the sides. So all the roof forces are going back to the kind of concrete core of the building. And because there's still going to be some movement, the glass is suspended from the roof. It doesn't bear on the ground, it's hanging. So in the case of a lateral movement, it can shift side to side. A house in Pacific, speaking of views, it's a house in Pacific Heights. And I think we're in collaboration with our client exploring some similar ideas about transparency and questions of privacy and what the front of a house should look like. So, you know, Pacific Heights, most of these are solid closed buildings with gates and fancy front doors. There is no real front facade here. It's a whole series of shifting levels. The louvered section at the bottom is a garage door. It's a very complicated garage door. It sort of folds open. Our client at a certain point was complaining about the cost of his garage door, and I said, it's not a garage door, it's the front of your house. Because it really is the only true facade that hits the street. And then behind that, the house kind of dissolves. At the top floor is where you saw the view in the first photograph. This portion in the front to the left in the slide was built above grade, and then we moved the ground up with it. So they kept their garden, their front garden, but it's now at the upper level. And then this space below the garden, that's actually a little indoor swimming pool. Well, it's an outdoor swimming pool. It's an endless pool. There's this access to the deck, and then the other side there's another courtyard. So, you know, this might be a little presumptuous, but to come back to Adolf Loos and talking about not recognizing your buildings in photographs, these spaces are really difficult to capture with two-dimensional photographs. You walk in the front door, you're confronted with this swimming pool, which can have these walls that disappear. So you're in an interior hallway, but then immediately to the right there's another courtyard. So when you're out in that courtyard, you're looking from outside through an inside space back to an outside space. And so the whole house, when these panels are open, sort of disappears. And then it disappears even sort of sectionally too. So now you're looking up above the pool, which is open to the sky, and you're seeing the level of the roof deck. And then this is the main level. So kitchen, living, dining, connection out to the roof garden, and then the city view is behind us. And on your right is a glass elevator that serves all stories of the building. Last house I'll show, this one is in Larkspur. very complicated site. It's on a ridge with crazy beautiful views that of course everybody wants to put their house right on top of the ridge, but the town says you can't do that. The ridge is sort of protected zone and we don't want people to see your house and don't want you to destroy the ridge. So there was this kind of back and forth and complicated design evolution here where we tucked part of the house into the hill. So at the beginning from the street, you're confronted with really a 3-story building. This is coming up a super, super steep driveway, which was a kind of massive construction project in itself. But you get to where that perforated metal is, that's the garage. So it's 3 stories here. As you move around the house and up the hill, it becomes 2 stories. But the lower level is it's the bedroom level, is tucked into the hill. So the back wall is a retaining wall. Then you move up through the house in this open staircase. This is the front door. And when you get to the top, the house kind of disappears. So it's 1 story, but it's 1 story with walls that kind of vanish into nothingness. So we succeeded in building on the hill, on the ridge, by not building on the ridge and convincing the planning department that this is such a modest little 1-story intervention on the ridge that it would be okay. So I talked earlier about just what it means to be an architect in California, and of course we all want to connect to the landscape, but really interested with all our work in being maybe even more provocative with these connections where you question assumptions about privacy and you maybe aren't just allowing people to step out to the landscape but bring the landscape into the house, where at the end of the day this is just a garden pavilion, not a big house. So, but this can exist in many different modes. It can be completely enclosed at night when it's cold. It can be completely open. It can be surrounded for privacy by curtains, or this is my favorite, it can be completely open but with the curtains drawn, so it's like being in a tent. And then what little, here I go again, I have to talk about structure. So on the right where those cabinets are, that is the structural core of the building. So there, again, is no lateral system. Particularly at the end, you'd expect to have a shear wall or a moment frame. Through this concrete core and a super rigid roof diaphragm, steel, we were able to get that stiff enough that we didn't need any lateral system at the end, and those slender little columns are only doing gravity loads. There's no lateral. So what little structure is left, we then clad in mirror, so it reflects the landscape, and even the solid part of the house disappears. So that looks like some Photoshop work, but that's actually a reflection of the oak trees outside the house on the left. And then this kind of tree trunk or core of the structural core of the house is clad in oak, so you get this kind of tree, fire, hearth to the house. So maybe to conclude or to respond again to the brief, the theme, the live, work, play idea from the standpoint of sort of building buildings and typologies, we're super interested in having really blurry boundaries about what these things look like and not respecting these typologies. But the other aspect of this live, work thing is just what the erosion of private life through our constant interconnectedness. So maybe with some of this chat, it's made me speculate a little bit on both the power and the challenges of always being connected, of everybody walking around life with an internet-connected image capturing device. I'm super interested in this idea that there is this kind of broader social fabric that documents and exposes more people to architecture. But it's interesting to think about the extreme of this is that then architects start designing buildings for the image or for the great photograph or the great Instagram moment, as opposed to all the other core values that architects should be thinking about. So I'm advocating a slightly maybe embrace with a little bit of a critical posture. And to come back to Super Studio, they started with a critique of modern materialism as becoming a kind of dystopia, and proposed this utopia of no more objects, no more stuff. We're all going to live in this interconnected web. Well, careful what you ask for, because now we're kind of living that. And it's, for some people, become its own kind of dystopia. So perhaps I'll leave with all the young students in the audience that it's your turn for the next utopia. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. Zach, you have the mic? Zach, you've got a question. Okay, let's wait for the mic so it gets on. No, but we need it for the recording.
I can repeat the question.
I just wanted to know who your structural engineer was.
Not the same on every one. The house was tipping Mar. Actually, no. The old prune factory was also tipping Mar. We had this chat with students as well. You know, there's I think engineering is just math, right? You solve these problems, you do the calcs. But maybe interesting relative to your program here, the ability for different disciplines to collaborate is fundamental. So engineers can know their stuff, architects can know their stuff, but if they don't know and respect each other's disciplines, you're not going to arrive at this kind of result.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Given the kind of a previous discussion about the standard office architecture, drop ceiling, concrete shells, and so on and so forth, that barely lasted 20, 25 years before they really became old and dystopian. How do you see this kind of wide open, airy, transparent, and see-through structure aging?
Yeah. So I'm always skeptical of kind of strict polemics, because I think that things tend to be cyclical. So about what's good or not good maybe is circumstantial, and there's never going to be one exact right answer to this. So, you know, those buildings, those office buildings, when they're built, they're perfect. They're acoustically good because you have absorptive surfaces opposing each other, carpet and drop ceilings. They're, all the executives got their private offices around the outside, and life was good. So now, where the priority has become collaboration, and people don't want walls between them, they also, by the way, don't want hierarchy, so you can't have a corner office. You actually have to let everybody enjoy the perimeter view. I mean, this is all good, and we've done a bunch of spaces that you guys have maybe work in some of work in some of these spaces. But I think that people have been experimenting with this new approach to office design long enough now to be reminded of why we didn't do this. So acoustics are generally terrible in a lot of these open office environments. And I'm sure you guys have all seen the studies. They've done the research, and people are less productive when they don't have a chance to get away, escape, work in private. There's more sick days in these open office environments. So, you know, as the pendulum moves back and forth, and we're noticing with a lot of our clients that they're looking for not a return to cubicles and private offices, but a little bit of the alternative space, So dealing with acoustics and having a place to escape to as the compensation for all the benefits of the open office environment. Did that answer your question?
Other questions?
Hi. So early on, you talked about how social media and the way that Instagram created a mosaic for your work, how it really inspires you to see the quilt of what your project looked like as a finished piece. And I'm wondering if you've considered representing your work on your own personal website or showing things through that lens on your firm's page.
Yep. Great question. Yes, we've talked about that. The short answer is yes, and we're probably going to do that. The longer answer is, at some point you say, well, why do you chase this when the whole idea of even having a website becomes a question? So maybe just everything should vanish into this collaborative fabric, and you don't even need a website anymore. I don't know. Maybe we're not there yet. So yes, but it's just so much work to do that.
One more question.
I like photography as well, but how do you see virtual reality and how we experience space kind of transform how architecture is shared, critiqued, experienced?
So first of all, I was very aware that introducing the topic of technology at Stanford, I was asking for trouble. I tried to limit it to social media and phones, but it's an inevitable extension of this discussion. So when the Google Cardboard things got shipped to New York Times subscribers, I got my little cardboard thing and I took it into the office, and someone in my office took a SketchUp model for a project that they had already been working on it with very little modification. They put it on my phone, I put it in the thing, and I was able to look at this project we were designing like, wow, okay. This is going to change everything. So, I mean, yes and no. It seems like probably every architect's going to do their client meetings with people wearing goggles pretty soon. But I think that's not the only conversation that you have with your client, and we're not going to completely immerse ourselves in that. It seems inevitable, though, that that will become just as CAD and other technologies have become part of the architect's tool belt in the presentation, representation, production, and eventually fabrication of work seems inevitable. We've not really embarked on it other than having fun and some entertainment value with some clients so far, but we haven't started using it as a real tool yet. Good question.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.